Hello and welcome to B2B Revenue Leaders. I'm your host, Dustin. This podcast is brought to you by Testimonial Hero. The customer content playbook, it's just out of date. Case studies are rarely read, reviews are usually gamed. What Testimonial Hero does is creates customer video content that you can use throughout your entire buyer's journey to close trust gaps and close more deals faster. On this episode, I'm joined by Jonathan Mahan and Lawrence Wayne from the Practice Lab. What we're talking about today is how deliberate practice, like an athlete or musician would do, is the key to success as a salesperson. We also talk about why role play isn't always the right tool for the job, and how to build a high-performing culture that focuses on practice. Hey, Jonathan. Hey, Lawrence. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
What's going on?
So this is going to be a first for the show. First time having three people here. So a little bit of experiment, but more brains should be more power, should be more thoughts here. So I think it's going to be a good one. I want to dive right in like we always do here and talk about, Jonathan, something you said before, that sales training is the wrong tool for the job 90% of the time. Someone who's been through many sales training, it has been the wrong tool for me as well. So I have my thoughts, but let's hear what you meant by that.
Yeah, I think most of the time when someone says, we need to bring in sales training, where that's coming from is that they're looking at the kind of selling that's happening on the sales floor and they're realizing they don't like it, right? The way the reps are selling it isn't the way they want them to be selling, and they want the reps to change how they're selling. And then they jump to the conclusion that sales training is what we need. That's usually wrong, because what traditional sales training is really, really good at is helping people to better understand selling and their job and the dynamics at play. It's filling their head with knowledge and filling their head with theory around what it means to be a good salesperson and examples of what good selling could look like. And there are some times when that's actually the missing ingredient, when people actually don't understand what they're supposed to be doing. They don't understand what makes for good selling. And in those cases where that's the missing piece, great, sales training is a perfect tool for the job. But on most teams, most of your sellers already understand what good selling looks like, right? They've already been taught many times what good selling looks like. They already aspire to sell really well. The problem is, in the moment, under pressure, with money on the line, 6 different things running through their head, it's hard for them to actually access all that knowledge they have. It's hard for them to actually implement it. So in most cases, when you look at your team and realize, I don't like the way they're selling, what's really missing is usually the skill. Right? Skill is the ability of the brain to pull off difficult maneuvers and tasks even under pressure. And that's what you really need your team to have, is more skill. Traditional sales training just equips them with more knowledge, better understanding, better concepts, and that's not really what you need, because most teams already, even if they don't know everything you want them to know, they sure as heck know more than they're able to implement, right? So generally speaking, taking a skill problem and throwing more knowledge at it is just not going to solve the problem the way you're hoping it will.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump off on that point a little bit longer. There's usually only 3 reasons someone doesn't make a behavior change. It's either they don't know what they should be doing, that hasn't been communicated well enough, they don't know how to do it, which is they lack the capability or skill, or they're not motivated to do it. And I think in a lot of sales teams, what I see are people saying, okay, we showed you what good looks like, we gave you the information, and you're not doing it. You must not be motivated. It's the seller's fault. And I think we overlook that skill piece and saying, okay, do they actually know not only what good looks like, but how to reproduce that? It's easy to watch a top level athlete perform, but you don't feel like, oh, I could just run out there and go do that. And I think in sales, we kind of miss that. And we say, okay, here's what good looks like. You should be able to figure it out. And that's the part we need more help with.
Yeah, I think the analogy there with sports is interesting. So as a Canadian, I watch a lot of hockey. Like, it's the only sports team we have in Vancouver, so I got to support them. I can't skate worth a damn. Like, I cannot skate at all. No matter how much hockey I watch, I know what it looks like. I know what you're supposed to do. I will fall on my ass on the ice. So I like that analogy there. I do want to talk about the skill side, because sales training is usually maybe 3 days, 5 days, depending on what you go through. It's hard to develop a skill in that time. So how do you transition that gap to get people to actually learn the skill and then actually retain it and implement it?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's kind of 2 layers to that answer. One is that during 3 to 5 days, if you're playing your cards right, you can actually grow skill, at least in some meaningful way. And again, practice is a great way to do that, right? If you spend 3 to 5 days practicing, using the kind of practice professional athletes use called deliberate practice, you can actually grow skill in 3 to 5 days. However, you're not going to grow all the skill that you need in 3 to 5 days, and it may not stick for as long as you want. So there is also this component of the continuation piece of rather than just relying on like a single event to train people, right? Instead, creating this kind of supportive ecosystem all around them to continually help them grow and develop in their skills. And that's something Lawrence actually has some experience with from his days back in enablement. So I'll let you take that one, man.
Yeah, there's a lot of analogy. I think in analogies, but I feel there's a quote that says that people don't rise to the level of their training, they fall to the level of their support. And I want to say it was like Archilochus, or like one of those Greek philosophers. But my experiences in sports, I played basketball in college. I'm a musician. I love learning new instruments. And yes, 3 to 5 days is enough to set the foundation and to see a little bit of momentum, which is great because it wants you to encourages you to keep going. But it'd be like trying to take a beautiful magnolia and planting it in the desert. It might last for a couple of days, but eventually the environment is not going to help it sustain. So in the same way, rather than try to take this finished thing and say, let's put it in a bad environment, let's focus a little bit more on the environment. And I think what that looks like practically is empowering our sales leaders. First line managers is a big part of it. I think they have a huge impact on the seller experience, and making sure that like the right sales manager can really change the trajectory of your career. And I've talked to so many sellers where they've had that right person in their corner who is a good coach, who's able to guide them in the right direction. So I think a lot of sellers get into the role for autonomy, for the ability to be kind of creative. And when you're slapped with SOPs and processes, and this is exactly how you need to do things every time, it feels a little prescriptive. So what you want to focus on is not just the training itself, but a lot more of the environment that exists in, so that you can actually not even reinforce, that's not the word, but support that growth over time.
Yeah, I think the deliberate piece, they're both on practice and on making the time to coach and making the time to support people. Because, Q3 just passed for a lot of us, but sales get stressful. You have a goal to hit and you just focus on that, and you can kind of stop growing and you can kind of just keep chasing your tail. So is that something you think is important to kind of build in? Is that focused, coaching, training time? And if so, maybe what does that look like in certain scenarios?
One of the things that really comes to mind for me is that there's almost 2 modes our brain can operate in. One is the performance mode, one is the improvement mode. And whenever you're selling, you're in performance mode, right? In performance mode, the brain's goal is simple. Do the very best I can reliably, consistently count on myself to do right now in this moment using the skills that I have. And of course, that's what you want your sellers doing in real sales calls, right? Is the very best they can reliably count on themselves to do in this moment. However, when your brain is in that mode, all that really happens is whatever your current best is just becomes more permanent. The brain has a very hard time actually growing new skill, developing new abilities, trying new things when it's in that mode. So what happens to sales teams who don't have this environment of practice, right, and improvement, is that they go from year to year, quarter to quarter, always just reinforcing whatever their current best is, never actually getting much better. There's this expression that I love that some people in sales don't have 10 years experience. They have 1 year experience just repeated 10 times over, right? That kind of gets the point across. Whereas the improvement zone or the improvement mode, that's a mode your brain can be in where it's not necessarily too focused on exactly nailing it right now. It's more focused on growth and development. Your brain has the ability and the freedom and flexibility to try something new that might be a little stumbly and awkward at first because it's the first time they've done it. But ultimately, by being in the improvement zone, that's where you can actually see growth happening. So one of the most important elements of this environment Lawrence is talking about is to make sure, whether it's in one-on-one coaching or team practice or peer-to-peer practice that happens between team members, whatever that looks like, make sure everyone's getting a good amount of time each week in the improvement zone to allow their brain the chance to actually get better versus just having them be in this performance mode constantly where all they're doing is, reinforcing and making more permanent their current best. The last little, analogy or visual to help with that and to help people understand the difference. When your brain is in the performance mode, again, you never get any better. And here's an area of our lives where we can see that. For most people, after age like 18, when they get behind the wheel of the car, they're no longer focused on becoming a better driver. They're just focused on driving the best they can right now and getting to their destination safely. And if you notice, most people after age, 20, probably don't become better drivers, despite the fact that, just statistically speaking, the average 65-year-old has spent 10,000 hours behind the wheel of a car. Despite being at that 10,000 hours, which so many people say is like the number to become, an absolute master, most 65-year-olds are not absolute masters of driving, right? And it's because the entire time they were in that car, they weren't in the improvement mode trying to become better drivers. They were in the performance mode, just trying to do the best they could to get from point A to point B safely. So similarly, a salesperson who's been selling for 45 years but has not spent much time in the improvement zone is kind of like that driver. They have lots and lots of experience, and whatever their current best is deeply, deeply ingrained in them, but they actually aren't getting much better from year to year, just like, again, a person's driving ability doesn't get much better from year to year. So I think the most important piece of that environment is that whatever that looks like, there's dedicated time each week for reps to be in that improvement zone where they're not supposed to be showing off, proving how good they are, proving their worth, anything like that. There's no money on the line. It's a place where they're intended to make mistakes, mess up, fail, get in their at-bats in service of, growing new skill and developing mastery.
Yeah, Jonathan, that last point is the one I want to jump off of as well, is the key indicator of that practice zone or in that improvement zone is the freedom to fail. It's the freedom to push your limits and do things that you wouldn't probably normally try when you're in that performance mode. So when you're really pushing your limits in terms of what you're capable of and what you're able to do, that's a great indicator that you're actually in that improvement zone because you're pushing the limits of what you're doing. I hear a lot from a lot of sales managers that I don't have time to coach, which blows my mind that I hear so often, but a lot of times it's because they're so focused on the deal. But then every end of quarter, they're finding themselves jumping into more calls and pushing for that short-term result. And a key indicator of practice is long-term thinking. It forces you to think and play that infinite game that doesn't really stop. You're always improving. So you have to find a balance. I'm not of the belief that you should only focus on skills. Like, we do have to close deals and there are metrics that we need to focus on. But if you're thinking long-term, you're going to focus on how can I put my sellers in that improvement zone more often? And what kinds of things can I do on a regular basis to do that?
Yeah, I think that can take a pretty strong leader to build that, because they are getting the top-down pressure as well of, but our VC firm said we got to grow 600%. So go grow 600%, like go figure it out, right? Which can be tough. And I want to talk about the deliberate side of practice. I think that's a really, really good point. Like, to throw another analogy, on the train here, my son's really into swimming. He's 7. If he does the wrong stroke over and over again, never gets any faster, but he keeps doing it. He's comfortable. So I have to try to break him out of it and be like, no, do it wrong, fail, like struggle. And I think that's a similar thing. And I think when most people think practice, they think for sales, they think role playing. I know you both have your thoughts on role playing and what might not work, what might not there. So let's dive into that. Is that the right tool for the job? What should you be doing instead?
Yeah, I think, Lawrence, actually, I can kind of get into some of like the specific details around the tactical differences between, really well-structured practice and more poorly structured practice. But Lawrence, you actually have a much stronger background than I have in like sports and music. So maybe if you want to start off just some high-level thoughts and observations you've had between the way salespeople train and the way, you would practice back in your college basketball days.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you think about certain drills that you'd run or certain role plays that you would do, the most important thing, and this relates back to my sports days, is that you want to make it unpredictable. I think a lot of times in a role play, it becomes just an opportunity for sellers to show off how much they know and how good they are for the rest of their team. When in reality, you want to make it as unpredictable as possible so that you have to stay on your toes. So if I get really comfortable giving a certain spiel on a topic, I might just go into auto drive. And it might sound like I'm really on top of what I'm saying and I know it and I'm really comfortable with it. But when you ask questions and you have to engage in a dialogue in a call, you don't really know what's going to happen. So the most important part of those role plays is putting you in a situation that you don't understand what's going to happen. You have to react. You have to be reactive. Because I know a lot of sellers who are really great at role plays and aren't the same when they're on a real call. And vice versa. I know sellers who are not very good at role plays, but when they're in a real call in that game situation, they perform much better. So it's a matter of making sure that you make it game-like reps. And the way to do that is to make it so that you don't understand what's going to happen. You have to react versus being predictive of what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it, because as someone who has been the role playee and the role player, I guess, like, role playing the buyer, you kind of feel like if it's a colleague, you can kind of feel like an asshole if you're going too hard and throwing them too many curveballs, right? Because you want them to look good. So I think breaking from that is super important. And like, how do you maybe get into that mindset of acting like a buyer instead of acting like a colleague, friend, fellow salesperson who's trying to tee them up?
Well, here's the interesting thing. So what, Lawrence and you just described is far and away the biggest limiter of role plays. And I would say it's probably the number one reason why like role playing isn't more common these days, right? Everyone's done some of it, but I don't really know very many teams who do it regularly. And it's because the value of the role play, the way it's typically done, is limited by your partner's ability to act like a real buyer acts. And unfortunately, nobody I've ever met can actually really act like a real buyer, right? Sometimes it's a matter of you're not sure whether you should be too easy or too hard, and that's the difficulty. But even when you're like kind of in that middle zone, you're still just behaving differently. Like, I just don't even know how to explain it. Someone who like is indoctrinated in the knowledge of the product and the solution, someone who knows how buyers are supposed to act, someone who's familiar with the pain points you offer, they're just going to behave differently and respond differently than a real person would. Which means what's happening in this role play is that, to Lawrence's point, it's a different environment. It's almost like the rules of the game are a little different in a role play than in real life. You can be great in a role play and suck in real life, or you can suck in real life and be great in a role play. Those are two different things. The analogy that comes to mind for me is imagine if you were in a flight simulator, but the density of air and the force of gravity in the flight simulator were different than they were in the real world. You could learn how to handle that plane in the flight simulator just fine, get in the real world and still crash because the real world it doesn't handle the way the simulator did. So the same thing happens in role plays where, again, you can be great in a role play and still fall on your face in the real world. So one of the things that we've had to do in order to kind of get around that is to actually look outside the world of sales and sales training to way a lot of other disciplines train and try to borrow some concepts from there. One of the things that's been really powerful for us is recognizing how important it is to like chunk it down and focus on one thing at a time. So sometimes this looks like chunking it down in terms of like what you're covering. So don't have someone role play an entire discovery call beginning to end. That's when you get into things being really unrealistic because again, your partner can never be a realistic buyer. So instead what you do is you zoom into very key pivotal moments in the discovery call and you just practice those pieces. One example of this might be, there's generally a moment in all discovery calls where the buyer will bring up some kind of surface level pain or frustration they've been experiencing. And an unskilled seller will take that at face value, make note of it, and say, great, we can help with that. And then they'll move right along. And maybe at worst, they just jump right into showing you the solution. Maybe at best, they just move on to other questions, but they move on. What you want your reps to do is you want to train them in that moment when they hear that surface level pain to suddenly get curious and to want to know more and to want to understand better the root causes of what's leading to that surface level pain that is mentioned, to explore further what the ripple effects and impacts of that surface level pain are. And you can just practice that moment, right? Practice the moment where the buyer says, yeah, we've been focusing on efficiency a lot this year. And then give the seller a chance to get curious and figure out what questions they can ask to explore that topic even further. So you don't role play the whole discovery call. You just role play that moment. Buyer mentions surface level pain. Seller gets curious, digs deeper. So that's just one example of like chunking it down. Focus on a specific moment. And one of the nice things about chunking it down is that then it kind of minimizes the effect of your partner not being able to play a good buyer, because nobody can realistically role play an entire conversation. But most people can realistically say the words, we've been focused a lot on efficiency lately. They can say those words, and they can say it in a pretty similar way to a real buyer would say those words. And you can practice how you respond in that moment to that prompt. Now, of course, you want to use a variety of different prompts there, right? You don't want to use the same prompt every time. So to Lawrence's point, you want to mix that up here. But it helps minimize that effect. The other thing I'll throw in too, not without going into too much detail, is that we've also found that role play itself can only take you so far. Even really well-structured, really effective role play is only going to do so much for you. We've actually developed 4 different styles of practice at the practice lab that we use that help us to kind of bypass these limitations. 2 of the forms of practice specifically were developed to solve that problem of no partner can play a realistic buyer, right? And it allows people to strengthen their brains and do practice without having to depend on a partner who can play a realistic buyer. And that those forms of practice have been quite powerful for helping us unlock some of the more like foundational level skills, right? So we'll use role play for simple things like how do you answer frequently asked questions, or how do you open a call, or how do you respond to an objection? That role play is pretty good for those. The more unpredictable side of sales, the more nuanced, the more human side of sales, the curiosity, the empathy, the reading body language, the thinking on the fly, those foundational skills, it's really hard to use role play to train those because, again, the role play environment just isn't real. So your brain can navigate that role play environment while never having to call on these foundational abilities of, curiosity and empathy and listening and deep thinking and reading body language and stuff. So those other forms of practice that we've developed, we call them skills practice and mental practice. Those are really great for helping to train those more nuanced abilities, those more foundational skills that your brain really needs to have if you're going to really be great in sales, such as, again, the ability to navigate a discovery conversation where you're both being deeply curious, but also highly empathetic. You're, hitting your main objective points you had going in, but you're also being fluid and adapting in the moment. A lot of those skills are hard to replicate in a role play. So again, other forms of practice work better in those cases. So all that to say, it goes beyond role play. Don't think just role play when you hear practice.
Yeah, I think the parallel there I see at least is kind of drilling versus scrimmage, essentially, with like role play being the scrimmage and drilling being the movement and small parts you practice that you can then use in scrimmage because it becomes second nature, but you have to practice it or it never happens, right? I do want to ask, because you mentioned, empathy in a few different areas of practice. Is this something you view kind of, as a curriculum of there's, 12 or 15 or 20 or however many skills that people should practice? Or do you come in, diagnose what the sales org is struggling with, and then come up with the plan around that? Like, I'm curious how formulaic versus specialized does this need to be?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I can answer, what we do on our side. So
Yeah.
We have found that to do practice really well in a way that sellers really like and enjoy and lean into, instead of rolling their eyes and saying, oh God, do we have to do this again? Doing practice in a way that deals with that problem we mentioned of becoming masters of role play who aren't really much better at selling. It actually takes some time. Anyone can do very simple, basic role play with very little prep, and there's some benefit to doing that. But the benefits of that kind of cap out pretty early. To the point where doing it 10 times more doesn't really give you 10 times the results, right? After a certain point. So to develop really, really highly effective practice does take time. So what we've done on our end is we've actually focused on developing practice programs to hone and develop the most powerful underlying skills and habits and default patterns that any seller needs to sell anything. And then we kind of, figure out when we work with a company, all right, of this menu of exercises, which are going to be the most impactful for your team, right? So maybe your team's really struggling. When they hear an objection, they just fold over like a cheap lawn chair, to use an expression from Jeb Blunt. Maybe that's your problem. Well, we can build new habits for them around how they respond to objections in a way that helps them slow down, manage their own panic response, get curious, shift a combative dynamic between them and the buyer into a more collaborative dynamic, and really settle into having a real conversation about this person's needs to figure out, is there a way we can move past this objection or is there not? So we already have, a framework built out for how to do that, and exercises and a whole practice program built out. So if that's what your sellers needs, that's what we come in, that's what we plug in. But other companies might say, no, they actually handle that well. What we're struggling with is that during discovery call, all their questions stay at the surface. They don't really get down to the heart of things. So to do that, we know the underlying skills that people need are really, really deep listening. They need empathy and the ability to, read the room, so to speak. They need to have a strongly honed sense of curiosity. They also need to have this almost like, linguistic ability to take that itch of curiosity and very quickly turn it into a really well-worded question, right? That can be hard sometimes in the moment to go from, ooh, I want to explore this area, to suddenly having a really good question that you could ask that's thought-provoking, that's direct, but without being, off-putting at all. So those are just like foundational abilities. And the way we do things is we have basically the same exercise for each team we work with. Obviously, there's modifications and adjustments to make it custom to their situation, their product, their industry, but it's the same exercises because ultimately every seller everywhere needs the same skills. They need a brain that's more curious, that notices things it didn't used to notice. They need a brain that can manage its own emotions and stay calm under pressure. They need a brain that can think quickly and, again, come up with impactful sentences on the fly. So we can equip people with those foundational tools, and then it almost doesn't matter the exact framework or methodology they follow, the exact industry they're in. So that has been what it's been for us. I'll say that for people listening to this, you can do practice on your own without us. And again, you can get some of those early wins really with any style of practice. Any role play is better than no role play, and will get you the first 20% of the benefits right away. So at least do that and start there before, you give up on practice altogether. At least try it out. And then again, companies like us exist to help if you want to take it further. But any practice is better than no practice for sure.
Really quickly, Dustin, just to circle back to your question, I think that there are certain skills that every team is going to need, but they're going to start at different points. There's different starting points that they have. So it is important to look at your different selling motion and understand what those key moments are in your sales process and figure out where your deals are getting stuck or where you're having the most trouble and go there first. And then we have the foundations for each skill or each moment that you have, whether that's discovery or demo or objections, like negotiation. There's different parts. And depending on where your deals are, what your pipeline looks like, and what your selling motion looks like, there's going to have to be some prescriptive aspect to it. But once we've identified and diagnosed that, then we have a bunch of frameworks that we've come up with to kind of figure out what skills we need to reinforce for those specific moments.
No, that's awesome. And I think I like the focus on a lot of the skills being like basically softer skills, I would say, which some people associate with a personality type as well, when it in reality it is a skill. Like, yeah, certain personalities are going to be better at empathy. And I like calling out the skill side as well, because people hear salesperson and they think super extroverted, loud, talking to everyone, schmoozing. A lot of the best sales reps I've ever worked with were very thoughtful, introverted, not typical salespeople. So I think both sides can learn. So one last question to kind of wrap it up on the skill side is, Lawrence, like you said, everyone's starting at a different point, both from a company and from an individual perspective. So for sellers who maybe have very specific problems they need to solve, they need to practice, and it's not a company problem, it's them recognizing I have this deficiency or lack. What's the step they should take there? Like they recognize, man, I suck at empathy during sales calls, or I zone out and I don't active listen. How can they start, practicing on their own when it's not maybe a company initiative that they need to take on?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that you mentioned there is that they understand and are aware, and the fact that they're missing that. A lot of times when you go to a seller and say, hey, you need to work on this, they might not have accepted that that's something that they're not good at. And you have to get alignment between them and their sales manager that this is something that we both want to work on and is really important. So the best sellers I do find are self-aware, and some of my biggest sellers or best sellers that I've worked with are the ones that will come to me and say, I'm really struggling with this part of my game or this part of my call. I want to work on this. How do I work on this? So the first piece is just be self-aware. That's a huge step and you can't overlook that. The second thing, especially when it comes to individual sellers, is partnering with your team. Like peers are a huge part of your learning experience and a part of that environment. So who are the people on your team who might not be at the top of the leaderboard, but who you find are really good at this particular skill? I think that's beneficial to the seller trying to develop their skills and beneficial to the seller teaching and sharing their skills because they understand what they're good at. So it takes you really calling out what everyone on your team and what those skill sets, where people shine. So it's really important to understand first, I have the self-awareness, then figure out what my peer group looks like and who has those skills and work with those people to kind of develop that. Also, you have all the information out there. There's the LinkedIn's, there's the courses and that sort of thing. But I think really working with somebody who's in the trenches with you, there's a big impact from that.
I'll add on top of that, there is one form of practice that reps can do on their own that's really effective. You can't find one of your peers to practice with you. And that is to actually, instead of using a practice partner to feed you prompts and give your brain a chance to react to what it's hearing, make decisions about what it's hearing, you can actually use a recording of a real sales call to feed you prompts and give your brain a chance to think and react and notice. So if you notice you're not great at listening, pull up recordings. They don't even have to be your sales calls, could be your peer sales calls, and just play them and really focus your attention on listening to what the buyer is saying, what they're really meaning, what they're not saying, the hidden meaning between the words, reading between the lines, reading their body language, right? And that's what you focus on. Or maybe you found that you have a hard time coming up with questions on the fly, right? Your mind just blanks. Well, same thing. Pull up a call recording, let it play. Anytime you get a little tickle of something in your brain, you're like, ooh, if I was the rep right now, I would want to explore that. Pause the tape right then and there and force your brain to come up with a question. And eventually you start getting better and better, more smooth and smoother with this. But this can be a great way that an individual can practice without having a practice partner. You almost use the recording of a customer as your sort of practice partner who again feeds you prompts that you can react to. So that is just one thing you could do if you can't find a practice partner. But in general, I'm 100% in on Lawrence's answer to that. The first option is go talk to your peers. But back before the practice lab ever existed, I was an account executive at a company and I wanted more practice. And I would just reach out to my peers, typically people who were newer at the organization because they were a little bit hungrier to learn and didn't have as much on their plate as the senior guys did. And I'd just say, hey, I want to get better at blank. Do you want to practice together? And I would say 3/4 of the time, they'd say, hell yeah, I want to get better at that too. And again, you don't have to, consume hundreds of books and hundreds of hours of, recordings to do at least decent style practice. Really, anytime you're doing some role play is going to be better than no role play. And, if you want to, dive in further, there are books out there that have been written about, the science of deliberate practice that you could read to inform your practice to make it even more effective. But definitely working with a peer.
Yeah, those are both great tips. And I think to wrap it up, my takeaway at least is learning doesn't equal practice. Like those are two very separate, very distinct things. So I think our listeners probably got a lot out of this one. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Lawrence. If they want to learn more about you guys, connect with you guys, learn about the practice lab, where should they go for that?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. And we actually even have a bit of an offer we prepared for folks who have listened to this who might want to try out this practice thing and might want to try, doing the deliberate practice that we've talked about that professional musicians and athletes do. So we've actually put together a sort of like practice in a box digital blueprint for a practice session that your team can run around how they respond to objections. And again, all the top science of how to do practice most effectively has been baked into this exercise. So you don't have to worry about like, is it effective practice? This is going to be some top-notch practice that really grows skill for your team. And it's already laid out waiting for you. It seriously is going to take, you maybe 30 minutes to like look over the materials to prepare in advance. And then you can run this practice session with your team. And it's going to walk people through this 3-step framework for responding to objections and responding to objections in a way that really helps the buyer to like let their guard down, right? Lower their defenses and open up their mind to considering other possibilities and hearing you out. It'll give you the chance as a seller to really learn more about what's going on in their world and what matters to them so you can craft a response that'll resonate with them. And ultimately, this framework just buys you the time you need as a seller to have a really valuable business level conversation with your buyer when an objection comes up, rather than feeling like you have to like panic and try to like crush the objection and overcome it right away, right? It's this nice framework that helps you kind of relax, settle in, manage your own emotions, get curious, and really have a good conversation with your buyer to figure out between the two of you, is there a way you can move past this objection or not? So that's what you'll be practicing. So, being that many folks will be listening to this near the end of the year, that's objection season. We figured that would be a really good practice exercise for folks to do. So if you want to run that session with your team, we're giving away that blueprint for free. Just email us hello@thepracticelab.co, and we'll send you those blueprints, and you can be doing some practice with your team with, like I said, maybe 30 minutes prep time max, and you'll be good to go with this do-it-yourself blueprint.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, I'll include that in the show notes for our listeners. And I know both you guys are pretty active on LinkedIn, sharing a lot there.
Oh, yeah.
Giving a lot of tips. So yeah, connect with both of them, follow along. Guys, thanks so much. I learned a lot about what's practice and what's not. And yeah, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us on, Dustin.
Thanks for joining me for today's episode. My key takeaway here is just the difference between practice and learning. So the analogy to sports here makes a ton of sense, for me at least. It makes it a lot easier. Just imagine if you just scrimmaged all the time. You'd revert back to, what you're comfortable doing, what you always do. So that's why athletes will repeatedly drill small parts of what they do in order to perfect them and have it become second nature. So make time for learning. You have to learn as well, but remember, take the time you need to practice. Thanks again for listening. I'll be back Tuesday with a new episode.